directly to Saudi Arabia, like Saudi Arabia's royal government.
Uh-huh.
Like, I play EA games. Should I I know this is illegal, but should I pirate them? Should I keep playing them?
So you're talking about something called private equity.
Yeah, private equity. 98%. That's just.
It's unavoidable at this point. Like, private equity is kind of taken off. And oh man, I could teach an entire class on the pros and cons of private equity. But let's talk about this offline in just a few minutes because I just started the recording and we've got a lot of stuff to go through. Should you pirate games? I absolutely cannot advise that you pirate games. But there's, some things you can do to get around private equity. All right, guys, today we're going to talk about the Constitution. This is one of the most interesting classes to me because, there's lots of ways we could kind of break this down. I really like computer programming. As a hobby, I write computer code. You can think of when you write computer code, you write like a program. You want a website to look a certain way, you code that out. But the rules that interpret that, the rules that take the things that you wrote and turn it into what you see, is usually called like the operating system or, the compiler. Or if you want to think about it in terms of sports, which is probably easier for most of you in here and at home to think about, if we take a football game, there's lots of different plays you could run. There's lots of different ways that you could structure your team, but everybody has to play by the same rules. The Constitution is the rules of that game. So while we have lots of different legislation and we have lots of different administrative rules and everything we have has to operate within the context of how the Constitution is written. Does that make sense so far? It's a really big deal.
Sorry.
Oh, you're fine.
Did you get some? I was in the bathroom.
Yeah, I'll get you at the end. So it's a really big deal. What's really interesting about it is a lot of people think the Constitution is this massive document. The actual Constitution, as it was originally written, is like 2 pages. I usually assign it for my students to read, and they say, "Oh my God, you want us to read the whole Constitution?" I say, "Yes. It'll take you 15 minutes." I'm not going to do that today. I might have you read it for next class. At some point, if you're interested, peruse it. We'll go over what's in it. But for this lesson, I want to talk about how we got here, some of the philosophical components of the Constitution, and why we have the Constitution instead of what we started with, which was the Articles of Confederation. Has anybody heard of the Articles of Confederation? Yeah. What happened to them?
I believe that they became unneeded and were discarded so that they could write something new.
Yeah, so they were discarded. They were definitely needed, but they had a whole bunch of weaknesses that basically made the government that came from the Articles of Confederation virtually useless. So today we're going to try and explain why the Articles of Confederation failed in plain English instead of lawyerese. If I start talking in jargon, please just throw a shoe at me or something. Or yell at me and be like, "That's too lawyery, stop." Identify the main problems that the framers faced when they were trying to come up with this new form of government to replace the Articles of Confederation. We're going to try and name and explain the key components or the key compromises in the Constitution, and we're going to describe the Constitution's core architecture, which is representation and separation of powers with checks and balances. So let's jump into this. For those of you at home and for those of you in the room, this is, of course, Chapter 2. I need you guys to be reading that. You might have noticed the reading quiz never came up. I decided that with somewhat little time left, we weren't going to do the reading quiz. I'll still post the questions so you guys can check your understanding, but it will not be graded. For those of you at home, for you guys, it'll be optional, but you don't have to take it. So, core problems with the Articles of Confederation. There's basically 4 of them. First, there's weak central authority, especially around funding and enforcement. So the way it's set up is there's a Congress, and this Congress has one representative from each state. There's no president, there's no executive branch, there's no court system. So Congress can say, hey, we all agree that we should have taxation, and everybody should pay for part of this revolutionary war we just had. However, how are you going to get anybody to pay? Since there's not an executive branch, since there's not a court system, there's nothing that can actually make people turn in their money. If we think about it today, and we need all of a sudden to, I like using controlled substances, if we all of a sudden need to make something a controlled substance because we come up with some sort of new drug, how are we going to enforce that? Well, under our system, we have the executive branch, so we have the FBI, we have police, all kinds of things like that. Under the Articles of Confederation, none of that existed. And because none of that existed, any law that was passed had, again, here's a little bit of lawyerese for you, had no teeth. Has anybody heard that saying before? What this means is that we have a law, and there's no consequence for breaking it. Is anybody familiar with what's going on with the Epstein files?
They're not being released.
Yeah, they're not being released. And this is a law that we would refer to as having no teeth, because there is a law that says that the Department of Justice must release the Epstein files, but because there was not a consequence built into it, what happens if they don't do it? Not much. All right, so second, under the Articles of Confederation, every state got a vote, and every state also had the ability to veto. So we have a big problem with that. Do you guys have that one friend that's always kind of disagreeable, that is like, I'm fine eating anything for dinner so long as it's exactly what I want? That's how the Articles of Confederation work. Nobody has that experience. Congratulations, you all have amazing democratic friends. But if you imagine that, one person always wants to go get Chinese and everybody else is sick of it, and they say, no, fine, I just won't go. And that's kind of how this works. Because if you have 12 of the 13 colonies saying, hey, we need to put this law in the book, the 13th colony can say, yeah, but we don't want that. And we'll talk about why this is so important in a minute. But I just want to highlight the big differences. Because of this, there's a massive difficulty in responding to crisis. First, because there isn't an executive branch, because there's not a court system, the only thing that can get done in the government at this time is when Congress is in session. Well, I don't know if you guys know this, but at that point in time, people had to do things like farm and take care of their families. And we didn't have the legislative class like we do today, where people could spend their entire lives in Washington, D.C. Washington, D.C. wasn't even really a thing yet. So we have this situation where when there's some sort of crisis, if the Spanish decide they're going to invade our territory from the south up through Mexico, we can't respond to that because everybody has to come from all over our existing country to meet. And at that point, they might be able to come to a debate, but any one of those 13 colonies could destroy the compromise. If Spain is invading from the south, who cares about that? The southern colonies. Well, maybe we have something like Massachusetts that's like, hey, they're never going to get up here, so I'm vetoing anything. I don't want to spend money on that. Not a real life example, by the way. Don't go fact checking that, because you will find that I am making that up entirely. But the issue with it is germane. The fact that it's impossible to respond to a crisis with that situation is accurate. And then finally, there's a massive difficulty coordinating national policy. And we'll hear about something called the Commerce Clause when we talk about what's actually in the Constitution. But I want you to imagine this. Could you imagine if, instead of having this class in Jefferson City, we're sitting in St. Louis, and we want to go sell our furs that we collected in Missouri in Illinois? And so we decide that we're going to, just cross the river and sell our furs, and we get all this money for it. And then we come back to Missouri and we go back to our houses and we try and spend this money to realize it's no good here. That is a very real problem the colonists faced. I'm sorry, the brand new Americans faced. Each state had its own money, and one state may not honor the other state's currency. Similarly, states were restricting the type of commerce that could be done within their territories. So if I am a Missouri governor or representative or whatever, I might want to make sure that my Missouri citizens have the biggest advantage when it comes to how everything happens. So maybe I say, fine, we're going to set across the board a tax on any good that comes into Missouri that is not from Missouri, or if you will, a tariff. And all of a sudden the people who are in Missouri have a massive advantage, right? Is that fair? Does that support our country becoming as strong as our country can become? No. And we had things like this, especially when it came to commerce across the board. So the Articles of Confederation had massive problems. Can we fix the Articles of Confederation? Well, maybe. And when we had the Constitutional Convention, that was the original plan. The idea was that we're going to all get together in a room and sit down and say, how do we hash this out? How do we take this thing that sounded like a good idea and make it something that'll actually work? We're going to temper that idea, though, with this other idea. Because you have to keep in mind that the brand new Americans are terrified of creating what they just fought to get out of. Because they had just fought and won a war against a king who claimed to have divine right to rule and absolute power, and they didn't want to trade what they fought so hard for to basically just create that here in the United States. So the question when they started this whole process wasn't big government versus small government, although we're going to see that that's kind of what it became. It was, what minimum power do we have to give the national government to survive? So when you read through the Constitution, I really want you to keep that in mind. Because if you read through this, you're going to see that the Constitution really reads like a recipe of things that the government can't do rather than a recipe of things the government can do. There's different evolutions of Constitution. And ours is one of the oldest, obviously. Arguably, Great Britain's is even older, although they don't have a written document. Fun fact, their Constitution is a series of documents that, when read together, constitutes kind of their core operating principles. And we borrow a lot from what they had. If you think to yourself, like, oh, I know all about the Constitution, you have a right to be tried by a jury or your peers. That's such an American thing. That actually comes from the Magna Carta. It's a British thing. But that's part of Britain's core operating stuff. Anyway, our Constitution reads like a list of prohibitions. Modern constitutions, the ones that have been written in the last 50 or so years, read like a grant of power to the government. And it says the government has the right to do this, the government has the right to do this, everything else is reserved to the people. Ours says, here's the things the government can do, and here's the rights the people have with the Bill of Rights. Again, we'll kind of dive into the nuances of that in a minute. So let's do an example of why the government had such a difficult time under the Articles of Confederation. Have you guys tried to buy anything? I mean, you're probably too young to buy houses, but is anybody here thinking about, like, I want to buy a house someday?
Yeah.
Do you know what's the number one thing you need to worry about if you want to buy a house at your age? Yeah, credit score, right? Exactly. You want to be able to make sure that you can get a loan and get that loan at a good rate, because anybody will give you a loan. The interest rate might just be like, loan shark territory, or they might say, no, you can't have a loan at all. And I don't know anyone who can afford to drop cash for a house, especially at my age and let alone your age. A brand new country is kind of going through the same thing as you guys are right now, thinking about things like buying a house. When the United States wants to try and trade goods with other nations, why would you want to trade with the United States? They don't have any credit. We don't know if they're going to be around in 15 minutes. If we can present a united front, if we can all cooperate, maybe we do better. What kills your credit score, though?
Not paying it back.
Not paying a debt. Do you guys know what we had a whole bunch of after the Revolutionary War?
Debts to France?
Debts to lots of different places, including France. So we've got all these unpaid bills, and if we want to be able to have credit, if we want to be able to have standing with the with the global world, the rest of all the countries and everything, we need some way of repaying those debts. Well, that sounds easy. Let's just repay the debts. But let's say that collectively our class owes Lincoln University $1,000. Who's going to pay that?
If it's collective, then we all have to pay.
I was going to say, I don't see any volunteers jumping up saying, I'll do it.
What was the question?
If our class collectively owes Lincoln University $1,000, who's going to pay?
All of us together?
Sure. All right. I can't make you pay it. And so who's going to chip in? It's kind of like the collection plate at church, right? Like everybody knows they should put something in the collection plate, but how many times does it come by and we don't put anything in? Guilty as charged, right? This is the same thing the Articles of Confederation confer. We owe this debt. It would be in everybody's best interest if we paid it, but Georgia wants to take care of Georgia, and New York wants to take care of New York. And if we have to pay our money to this thing, then we're not going to have that money to take care of our people, right? So it doesn't get paid. So that's one vivid example of how this is basically failing. All right, so let's do one more example, but we'll do it kind of in present tense instead. So imagine Lincoln University has no administration at all. We only have clubs. Every club must agree before anything happens. What breaks first? Are you guys in student organizations of any sort? Nobody's in a student organization? Nobody's in a fraternity or sorority or... Oh, you guys... It's so bad for you. You're missing out. What are you in?
I'm in gospel choir.
I'm sorry?
Gospel choir.
You're going to have to say it one more time.
Gospel choir.
Gospel choir. Okay. There's some coordination that goes on with gospel choir, right?
Sure.
Like, we want to make sure that your big performance doesn't happen on the same night that homecoming happens on, right?
Right.
Things like that. When it comes to which organizations are going to get money, there's some coordination that goes on with that too. If the student government has so much money to give out, there's going to be a procedure for who gets what and how we divvy that out. But if everybody has to agree on everything, what's going to break first? What do you think is going to be the first thing that people are like, hell no, we're not going to do that? You can play if you want. I picked on you enough, I think, but... Anybody have anything they think is going to be the first thing to break down? This is the biggest fear when you're doing like jury selection, is that people sit there like you guys are doing, like trying so hard not to make eye contact, trying so hard not to move. But I mean, we can call on people, but it's early and I've got a lot of stuff to cover. So I'll just give you 3 things that could break. There could be coordination failures. We could find out that what's the biggest fraternity on campus? Alphas? Do they have like house parties? No? You don't know? Well, let's pretend like they do. Let's say Alpha's house party, the biggest one they're going to do is on the same night that homecoming is going to be, and it's also the gospel choir concert, and also the biggest sorority is going to have their formal. And by the way, Professor Sartorius set your final for that day, or some insane thing like that. If we don't have some way of working together, if we don't have some way of solving our differences and working as a team, we're going to have coordination failures. Those sorts of things are going to happen because, who cares, right? Similarly, who's to say the student government doesn't take all the money to have a giant concert and doesn't give money to any of the other organizations? I mean, that's something that if we don't have any enforcement, that could happen.
Checks and balances?
Yeah, well, we're going to get to that because the example right now is under the Articles of Confederation. And the last thing is we have free writing. You can have organizations that don't have to do any of the things that normally would require an organization because there's no thing governing how organizations do things. You get the benefits of being part of the school, but you don't have to do anything to do that. That's not fair. So that's an example of kind of if we were to take the Articles of Confederation and apply it to what I thought more of you would know about, but my apologies. So that's why we didn't just tweak the Articles of Confederation. We kind of designed an entirely different thing. The founders were trying to balance a whole bunch of different things. So first, they were trying to balance this concept of power versus liberty. And we talked a little bit about this in the beginning with the concept of a social contract. And by we, I mean our founding fathers were extremely influenced by John Locke, who wrote of this concept of the social contract. And in fact, it was his book that said everybody has the right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of property. We tweaked that to the pursuit of happiness, but it's life, liberty, and property. But if you want to live in a society, you have to give up certain freedoms. I had a partner once, a business partner, and he was an anarchist, which, I generally don't have a problem with most people's ideas, but anarchy is one that's kind of interesting to me because in an anarchist society, the concept of having property or having protections doesn't exist. If we don't have a government, if we believe that everybody's conscience will take care of everything, how's that going to work? I told him, I'm like, I don't see too well. You're going to come to my house one day and be like, that's a mighty nice house. I'd like to have it. And I'll be like, no. And you're going to be like, well, I'm going to take it. And, you'll just take it. I'll fight and die, or, that's the sort of thing that can happen with an anarchist government. Don't believe me? Who in here has read Lord of the Flies? Yeah, that is basically an illustration of how anarchy works. And if you remember at the end, people are ashamed of what they did, but they crushed Piggy with a rock so they could get his glasses and ended up breaking the glasses in the process. So it was sad for them. We have to give up some of our liberties. We can't just go around taking whatever we want if we want to live in a society. But how do we strike that balance? How do we do something that's fair? The government has enough power that they can do what they need to do, but the people maintain as much freedom as they can maintain. So that's one of the three balances they're trying to, strike. The second is this national capability with state autonomy. This is something that hasn't been tried in the world before, where you have this two-government system. And the concept of federalism is unique here. Because if you look at other societies that kind of seem to operate in this state system, what you see is maybe like a very loose confederation with completely autonomous states. If you think of Greece, like Athens was its own thing. And it might get together with another city-state to do something on the Peloponnese in ancient Greece. But there's no centralized Greek government at that point. If you look at Italian hill towns, for example, you see the same kind of thing. There might be some sort of kingdom that claims dominion over everything, but if you go to Montepulciano in Tuscany, it, because of how remote it was, could operate all by itself, and nobody really knew it existed. So this kind of concept of we're going to have state governments and federal governments, it's a new thing. How do we balance that so that the federal government can do what it needs, but the state government gets to control what needs to be controlled at the local level? And then the final thing is the majority rule versus minority protections. And we talked about this a little bit, and I used the example of Robert's Rules of Order, that most rules of order, government, parliamentary procedure are designed to make sure that a significant minority can be heard. And that's the other thing our government wants to do. Our founding fathers strive to strike that balance of how do we make sure that the little guy can be heard, but the majority gets to win. The big conflict basically came down to representation, though. Because there's basically, usually when I have more time, usually when kind of the structure of the course doesn't fall on a 2-day week, we do an exercise where I kind of give you guys roles. But I want you to think about this. We've got 2 different types of states at the moment in the United States. And again, when I say at the moment, I mean 1790-ish. We have the agrarian states, the southern states that have mostly farming, and we have the northern states that have a lot more of the industry. They have to work together, of course, but how do we want to divide up representation? There's 2 plans. There's the Virginia plan and there's the New Jersey plan. I introduced these 2 things because first I want you to think about the difference in what people want. The agrarian states are going to want things that protect farming and things that are good for wide open spaces, where the more industrial states, the northern states are going to want things that are good for business and things that are good for cities. They also want differences in representation because under the Virginia plan, because Virginia is more populated than some of the other southern states, they want representation by population. So if we have 10 people in state A and 5 people in state B, state A should get more votes, right? Who thinks that's a good idea? Raise your hands. Nobody? Nobody thinks that's a good idea. Okay. Well, that's the Virginia plan. The New Jersey plan is different. This is equal representation. So each of our 2 states gets the same number of votes. So you guys have 10 people over here. You guys have 5 people. You get 2 votes, you get 2 votes. Is that fair? Who thinks yes?
I mean, technically, but there's more people to vote.
Yeah, why is it not fair? Why, if you guys have the 10 people, why are you like, this sucks for us? I'll ask the question the opposite way to this side of the room. If you guys have the 5 people, why are you like, score, winning?
Because since we have like less people, we have less opinions.
Yeah.
So our votes are like very much, if that makes sense.
Yeah. You guys have more voting power than you guys have. If we divide it up that way, you guys have, half the voting power. But if we do it the other way, then you guys have twice the voting power as they do. And this is one of the hardest things for the Founding Fathers to work around. They end up coming up with the Great Compromise. Does anybody know what the Great Compromise is?
They do both.
They do both. Exactly. And to this day, the House of Representatives is apportioned by population. Rhode Island, I think, has like 2 representatives, where California has like 175. I'm just kidding. It's not that disproportionate. I think California has like 40 something though. But the Senate is 1 state, 2 votes. That's it. No more. By creating this Great Compromise, they were able to make both sides happy because the House is population based and the Senate is equal states. But why is this still politically explosive today?
Isn't that electoral college?
The Electoral College has a very similar component. The Electoral College is effectively your senators plus your representatives equals your number of electors. Why is this? Why are people like? And you're on the right track with thinking about it in terms
the
of
same issue, like the same group problem where like the majority wants one thing and that's what it should be.
yeah. So in the last election, Donald Trump won the popular vote and the electoral vote. But in the last presidential elections where a Republican won, going back, so it was Trump and Bush, I think. I don't know if it was Bush the older, but definitely Bush the younger. The popular vote was lost. What does this mean? Well, we've got what? Like, let's just make the math easy for everybody playing at home and me, and say we've got 20 people in here. And we've got state A with 15 people and state B with 5 people. And you guys have, for, demonstration's sake, the same number of electoral votes. And you guys go Democrat in the election. So like 10 people for the Democrat, well, let's say 11 people for the Democratic candidate, 4 against. And you're going to divide your electoral votes up in a similar proportion. You guys go 5-4, the Republican. And so we have a situation where the Republican gets 9 votes from a popular standpoint, and the Democrat gets 11 votes from a popular standpoint. But when we filter that through the Electoral College, when we send our electors to Washington, because you guys are doing it proportionally and you guys are doing it winner take all, the Republican wins. They got fewer people voting for them, but they still win the presidency. It's still an issue today, how we divide things up. Why should, for example, Missouri have less of a say than California in the way that our country is run? Why should Missouri have more of a say than California in the way our country is run, right? Like, these are still things that we debate about today, but I would argue, and I don't know if the book goes into this detail, but I would argue that that's actually a good thing. And the reason I think that might be a good thing is because it creates gridlock. And I think one of the ingenious things about the way our Constitution is put together is it forces people to compromise. It forces people to work together. So instead of trying to create a set of rules that seems perfect in every situation, there's a set of rules that probably works in most situations and makes us work together in the others. So a couple of compromises that we need to talk about. First, the original authors of the Constitution wanted to abolish slavery. That was taken out because they couldn't get the southern states to get on board with that. And so another slavery-related compromise that was put in was called the 3/5 compromise. Because there's this concept of like, all right, well, the southern states have less people, but they have more slaves, so they should count when we are tallying up how many votes they get. We're not going to allow slaves to vote, but we're going to count them towards, we're going to count them towards how many representatives we get. It seems horribly unfair, no matter how you slice it, but the thing that ended up making everybody get on board was the 3/5 compromise, where every slave counted as 3/5 of a person in terms of calculating representation.
But they don't even vote, so why do they get representation if they can't make the choice?
Yeah, I mean, it's a fascinating issue here. And when we start talking about civil rights, we'll kind of get into a lot of that because there was also debate as to whether or not slaves were considered citizens, right? Which is why we have the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment, where we basically have citizenship by naturalization. Like, if you're born in this country, you are a citizen of the United States. Again,
And didn't the South still give problems so that it wasn't going to happen?
yeah, and so there was also things that, again, this is kind of foreshadowing a little bit. There were also tons of problems with that, and then we had things to try and prevent Black people from voting and things like that. So, all right, the federal government says we have to extend this, we have to allow this. Well, let's create poll tests. We want to make sure you can read the ballot if you're going to use the ballot, right? Makes sense. Except they made the test so complicated that nobody could pass it. Have you guys ever heard the term grandfathered in?
Yes.
Do you know what this term means now?
I forgot.
It means if you're doing something that's not exactly compliant with the law, but it's been done for a while, it's probably okay. A big area we see this now is with like accessibility. Like, the governor's mansion may not be accessible, but it's grandfathered in. It doesn't need to comply with the Americans with Disabilities Act because it's a 200-year-old building kind of thing. I don't think it's 200 years old. I'm making up that number, but it predates the ADA by a lot. Where that term actually came from is the grandfather test, because they made these poll tests so hard that most of the white people couldn't pass it either. And there's some YouTube videos out there where they will ask you questions from the poll test, and none of them make any sense. But they didn't want to disenfranchise their own people, and so what they did is they... Yeah, so definitely lots of things messed up about that. The other thing to note is there are some commerce-related compromises. We'll get into that in more detail in the Commerce Clause. Great conversation with respect to that, but we've got like 8 minutes to cover the rest of the class. So one of the big things with this, especially as we talk about these compromises, I want you to know, is that the Constitution isn't this like philosophical essay. It's not designed to get everything perfect. It's a negotiated settlement designed to make a large republic governable. It's obviously got problems. The Founding Fathers kind of expected that we would, from time to time, have to revisit this. They wrote that in there so that we could amend it and things like that. Because at the end of the day, the idea was never that this would be perfection. All right, we'll cover most of this next time. But I think I would like you guys to go ahead and read through the Constitution for next class. Like I said, it's 2 pages. The preamble takes about 30 seconds to read. And I'm going to tell you what I'm going to ask you next time. Article 1, which governs legislative powers. It's first. I want you to tell me why. And then we're going to, I want you to think about one phrase that kind of explains to you what government is for. So you can either copy that out or circle it. I don't care how you do it, but we'll talk about that next class. All right, so there are 3 big design choices as you're reading through the Constitution. First is that representation component we talked about, the House versus Senate. The second is that powers are separated between the executive, judicial, and legislative branches. I'm sure in the textbook there's a beautiful graphic of this like snake eating its tail sort of thing. But when we talk about separations of power, that means that each branch has a different job. Back in the day, when you had kings that were strong before their nobles kind of took things over, you had a branch of government where they were judge, jury, and executioner. They got to do everything. They got to make the laws, figure out who was breaking the laws, and enforce the laws. Now we have different branches that do different things. The legislative branch is tasked with making laws. The executive branch is tasked with executing laws. And the judicial branch is tasked with interpreting laws and settling disputes under the law. With that, we have some checks and balances. Each branch can block the things that the other branch does within reason. So we talk about checks and balances. A check, for example, is the fact that the president can veto legislative action, or that in order to make a judge, the president gets to nominate the judge and the legislature gets to vote on whether or not that person should be confirmed as a judge. So those are checks. But when I say balances, these are also things that prevent any branch from kind of abusing their discretion. So an example of a check is the fact that a Supreme Court judge is appointed for life, and within their term, their salary can't be decreased. Why is this important? Let's say you guys got to control my salary. You can't fire me, but you got to control my salary. And you don't like the fact that I'm having you read the Constitution. What could you as a class do to make me...
so low that you don't want to work?
Yeah. And so, kind of understanding this, if we say, all right, my salary is fixed, you can't change it. You can increase it, but you can't decrease it. And you can't get rid of me that easily by just being like, you're out. We prevent something political happening. We prevent it from being like, hey, he's doing his job. Now they're going to punish him. Again, this is another area, and I don't remember which student asked me, but somebody said, is it difficult to teach this with what's going on in our country at the moment? And this is one of those areas where, yeah, it's getting a little hard because we have checks and balances like this in play. For example, there are various agencies that are run by people who are supposed to be politically neutral, like the Federal Reserve Bank. But we saw, I think last week or the week before, that the Department of Justice is investigating Jerome Powell, the chairman of the Federal Reserve, primarily because the president wants him to lower interest rates. There's a lot of economic implications there that we're not going to get into, but when we see power like this being exercised, it's really kind of troubling from how do I explain this to people? Because in an ideal system, that's not something that would occur. How's it going to happen this year, next year? I don't know. So it makes it a little difficult to tell you for sure that this works. But if we follow it as it was intended, it works. It's when we get away from the intention. All right. I think we can cover this really fast, and then we will move to what we're covering next week. No, we're going to skip that one. All right, so next class we're going to start talking about how the Constitution has changed. We'll review what's in the Constitution, how it gets interpreted, and how constitutional arguments actually work. So what I want you guys to do for next class, please read Chapter 2, read through the Constitution. You can just Google it and find it. And I will take that assignment I gave you guys and make it a mini assignment so that can be your participation points for the week. So that'll be posted for you this afternoon. And that's it. Any questions about any of the stuff we covered today? I know we moved really fast through it. Shoot.
Was it Venezuela that we took the time?
Was it Venezuela that we what?
Yeah. How did they do that without checks and balances? They just did it?
Great question. That's a loaded question, too. All right, so the president has limited peacekeeping power. One of the things that you'll read in the Constitution is that the legislative branch has the power to declare war. But the president's the commander-in-chief of the armed services. So it's been interpreted that the president can do anything that's necessary and proper to basically affect his job. And one of the things that might be necessary and proper is to respond to an immediate threat. The way that the White House has legitimized what has happened in Venezuela is to claim that this is a policing action, that they were not invading Venezuela, but they were effecting the arrest of a fugitive. I don't exactly know how that works when that fugitive is the head of state, and it's for the allegations of a crime committed outside of the United States or any of its territories, and the arrest happens outside of the United States or any of its territories. It's going to be something people are debating for years. When I'm here in 20 years teaching American government, I'm going to tell my disbelieving students, remember that one time that this happened. So I don't have a good answer for you. Any other questions? All right, if I didn't get you on the roll, come see me.